Ladies and gentlemen, to say that expectations were high going into AMD's next Horizon event is an understatement. We were expecting a lot more details concerning the RX 5700 series, and given the leaks we were also expecting AMD to reveal the 16-core 3950X processor. And AMD didn't disappoint us. There were those details and many others that we will be covering in this video. Now, because of the sheer number of announcements and the fact that AMD have also provided me a lot more technical slides of details that were just not covered during the next Horizon event, I just won't be able to squeeze all of this information into one video. It would end up being like a 5-hour video, and I would basically, just go insane. So instead I've decided to focus this video on the announcements of last night and my opinions of it, plus also provide a couple of key architectural differences for both Zen 2 as well as RDNA, plus also discuss a few things that were not in the live stream as well, such as, the next generation RDNA most likely having ray tracing of some description. But we'll go into that and how it works later on. So first things first, the event was about an hour and a half, and it was pretty packed. I did feel that the parts with the games developers towards the end of the event kind of slowed things down, and I wished that maybe that wasn't there, or perhaps they just did it in a slightly different format. But overall, the entire conference was very, very interesting, and AMD did put on a very strong showing. We're going to start with the processor side of the lineup, and then we're going to discuss the GPUs, because I think it's better to section the video off like that. So in terms of the processors, we obviously have the 3600, which is the lowest end SKU, which is going to cost you $200. It's a 6-core 12-thread processor, and the highest end SKU is, of course, the 16-core 32-thread 3950X, which is going to cost you $750 US. Yes, it's expensive, but it also has a boost frequency of up to 4.7 gigahertz. And the performance numbers that AMD are showing off for games is very impressive. So we're going to go through a couple of different examples, and then we're going to go through my thoughts on that, and then also some of the architectural stuff. So for the 3600X, AMD are positioning this CPU against the 9600K. And yeah, the results are very similar to Intel's CPU. Give or take, depending on the application, PUBG being slightly better apparently on Intel, but other games such as Devil May Cry being basically a wash. I mean, when there's just a few frames per second in it, particularly when you're over 200 FPS, it doesn't really make that much of a difference at that point. And also, of course, for content creation, because of SMT on AMD's CPUs, well, as you can imagine, it favors AMD's processors rather nicely. Applications such as Adobe Premiere offer about 30% increase. Cinebench, which scores very well traditionally on AMD CPUs, is over 40% faster, which is actually really impressive. The worst performing application for AMD is 14% faster, which is POV Ray. And to call it worst performing is, well, yeah, it's not exactly a terrible score, is it? Expect that for the higher end, the 3900X is going to be about the most popular CPU, and the frame rates here look very similar to what you have for the lower end processor SKUs. There's not actually that much difference in terms of raw games anyway, between the lower end processors and the higher end AMD processors, which is obviously really good news for folks who just want to do some overclocking, or they just want a CPU which is aimed at gaming. So that's absolutely fantastic, but when it comes to content creation, of course, all those additional threads absolutely stomp the 9900K. You're looking at up to 50% performance increase compared to Intel's offering, with the average being somewhere in the high 20, I would say. I could start going through a lot more performance data, but I think you get the point by now. You've seen the slide yourselves. This would bring me to my first criticism of the event, and that is that the slides themselves were showing gameplay at 1080p. So 1080p performance, which is great. That's exactly what you want. That stresses, of course, the CPU. We all know that. That's not me telling you anything you didn't know. What I didn't like, though, is that the gameplay that AMD was showing for different titles was running at 1440p. I don't know why they did that. I didn't like it. They should have showed the exact same titles or whatever games they were going to use, but at 1080p, and been more transparent with the GPU. That should have been right there on screen, along with the system configuration. I think that would have probably made for a stronger showing. But we're not done with the CPU side of stuff, and there is actually a lot more good things I want to discuss as well. So one good thing is that there has been a recent Windows update. This took place on the 10th of May, and the too long didn't read of this update is it attempts to make sure that threads stay within their own CCX. So rather than jumping across CCXs, which can increase latency, this update, they've worked with Microsoft to attempt their best to do this. And basically, it's just improvements to the scheduler. According to their updates, this has drastically increased performance. We're looking at between 6 and 15%, depending on the application, with Rocket League actually increasing performance significantly. I mentioned that AMD have provided me a lot of architecture stuff, and well, they have, and I'm not going to go through all of it in this video to do a full analysis, but of course 7nm provides twice the density, half the power consumption, and about 25% increase in performance using the same power consumption. And they're also, of course, pushing the 15% IPC gains, which is really good, and they're nudging the IPC uplift every 2 years, which is kind of amusing. There have been some rather significant changes to the front end, integer, and floating point units as well. AMD are referring to the level 3 cache as the game cache, and they have doubled it, of course, with the Zen 2 architecture. According to their own data, this reduces memory latency by up to 33 nanoseconds, and drives performance up to 21% higher compared to the previous processors. Honestly, the general look and feel of the architecture does look similar to the previous Zens. So it's not like, oh, they've drastically changed it to be completely and utterly unrecognizable, but there are definitely some large differences. There's the level 3 cache that I've just mentioned, plus there's also a much greater support for different instructions. So we have support for a single operation AVX 256, and there's also no frequency penalty for running AVX2 mode. We also have a confirmation that the level 1 instruction cache has been halved to 32 kilobytes, but it also has double the associativity. We also have a doubling of the MICROARCHITECTURE cache, which is obviously going to definitely increase the IPC of the processors as well. Another very important change is the misprediction rate. They have actually lowered the misprediction rate by 30% on this next architecture, which is actually pretty damn impressive. So there's actually another important thing we need to discuss while we're on the subject of CPU performance, and that is that the numbers themselves are actually the least favorable possible from AMD, and they've done this deliberately. So basically, they've done two things which hurts their own performance. The first is that, well, they are not using the May update reportedly for their performance numbers for games. So that obviously means that the performance numbers we're seeing from AMD here are worse. The second thing is that they've given Intel a leg up by not using the security mitigations, or vulnerability mitigations, for their line of processors. In other words, this is the best possible scenario for Intel and the worst possible scenario for AMD. So why have they done this? Well, I think it's a couple of reasons. One, so that people could be like, well, they've literally given Intel every chance in the book. But two, I think it's because most reviewers will not want to redo all of their 9900K numbers, for example. And that's not necessarily reviewers' fault. It's like, if you don't have a 9900K, you can't get the numbers again. And so sometimes you have to send those review samples back, or you just don't have time to go back and test all of those numbers or whatever. So what AMD have done here is smart. They've basically said, well, look, these are the numbers that review websites most likely will be using, and these are the numbers that we're going to be using. So now let's have a look at the RDNA graphics cards. AMD so far have announced two different SKUs. The RX 5700 card, which is going to be targeting the RTX 2060, and the RX 5700 XT, which is going to be targeting the Nvidia RTX 2070. So let's have a look at the specifications, and then we're going to be delving into the performance. The card has 40 compute units versus 36 of the 5700, which also has a slightly different clock frequency as well. So the base frequency of the XT is 1605 MHz compared to 1465 MHz. Base and boost frequencies are very well understood by now. Boost frequency is 1905 MHz compared to 1725 MHz. We all know how base and boost clocks work, so I'm not going to spend time explaining that in this video. A game clock, though, is a bit different. It's a new figure that AMD are using, and it's basically the average clock speed that they expect the cards to be running at after gaming for a certain amount of time. So there is 1755 MHz, which is generally achievable apparently on the XT, and the target frequency of the 5700 vanilla is 1625 MHz. So we're looking at 130 MHz difference in clock frequency. So the number of shaders, of course, times by the boost frequency is what gives you the number of teraflops that the GPU is capable of running at, or if you prefer, its peak FP32 performance, which in the case of the 5700 XT is 9.75 teraflops. Honestly though, that number is very, very misleading. We're going to get into why in just a moment, but essentially it's because the 5700 XT does a lot more work and is a lot more efficient compared to its predecessors, including Vega 56. So as for the memory frequency and bandwidth, it's identical, 448 gigabytes per second between both cards, so that's 14 GBps memory, 256-bit bus, and 8 gigabytes of memory. We're also looking, of course, on the same manufacturing process, which is TSMC 7nm, and a 225 watt versus 180 watt TDP. The price of these cards is $450 and $379 for the lower end SKU, and the die is 251 mm squared. So that's 10.3 billion transistors, which is not that huge. It's a little larger than what Polaris was, which was 230 mm squared, well 232 if you want me to be exact. So that's very dense. You're looking at around 80% increase in the number of transistors, but only a tiny fraction larger. AMD have also increased color compression, so there's delta color compression virtually through the entire pipeline, which combine that with additional memory bandwidth, once again 448 gigabytes per second, versus Polaris, which only had a measly, in comparison anyway, 256 gigabytes per second. There's obviously a substantial increase in performance. There is a lot of architectural stuff that I need to go through, quite honestly. AMD have provided so many architectural changes, so many documentations on the architectural changes, that makes more sense for RDNA. It's going to take me a couple of days to go through all of this, as well as the Zen 2 stuff, but one thing that is definitely apparent are the changes in how the wavefronts work on the GPU. If you're unfamiliar, a wavefront is essentially a group of work. We have 64 with GCN, which is actually the same number, of course, for consoles as well. RDNA drops this to 32 threads wide, so what this means is that the width of the SIMD have also increased from 16 slots to 32 slots. This basically means SIMD, single instruction multi-data 32. So now the wavefront and the SIMD match in size. This essentially means that a wavefront can now be passed through the architecture in just a single cycle. There was actually 4 cycles required for this for previous GCN parts. For compute as well, we have up to twice the number of ALUs, access to twice the number of registers, and 4 times the cache bandwidth. Essentially, this GPU is a radical departure. We have a greater number of... There's also 4 enhanced asynchronous compute engines, which have, quote, priority tunneling changes to the geometry processing, which have up to 4 primitive units which perform vertex reuse, primitive assembly, reset index, culling and tessellation. Also a very fascinating slide, which according to AMD anyway, the process gain is on 7nm is nowhere near the contribution to performance as actually the per clock enhancements, as well as a small contribution, probably around 15-ish%, eyeballing it, from design frequency and power. So that's obviously a lot of changes just simply from the clock enhancements. And compared to the Vega 10 architecture, we're looking at 2.3 times performance per area. Once again, NAVI is 251 mm squared compared to 495 mm squared of Vega 10, and a 50% improvement per watt. If you're wondering, by the way, how they got that figure of 1.5 times per watt, they are using a Vega 64 GPU, but they cut down the number of compute units active to just 40, and they are of course comparing that to NAVI. Okay, so what about performance? Well, we have several slides from AMD using several games. Some of them are esports titles and also a lot of AAA games as well. So we'll start things with the RTX 2060 versus the 5700. Obviously, it does depend upon the application. Certain titles like Forza do really well, up to 123% or 23%, let's just be honest, faster than the RTX 2060. Other games, such as Ghost Recon, are around 5% faster than the RTX 2060 is capable of. On average, it's not bad. Anything from 6% to around 12%, depending on the game, seems to be the average to what you're going to be getting with the RX 5700. Switching things up to the RTX 2070 versus the 5700 XT, and the leak slide that I covered a couple of days ago, where I went into more detail, is 100% accurate, with around 106-107% being the average performance increase if you were to upgrade, not that I'd recommend it, from an RTX 2070 to an RX 5700 XT. So what do I think of NAVI and the RX 5700? Honestly, it is definitely a right step for AMD. I can definitely see how this is going to benefit the consoles. I suspect that it's going to make optimization of games on the next generation consoles. It's going to be really fascinating to see exactly what happens in terms of the number of compute units and shaders on the next generation consoles. If you look at the die size of NAVI, and you add in the space for Zen 2 and the I/O die and blah 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 blah, it does start to become a very large APU. So I'm not sure how many compute units we're actually going to see for the next generation consoles. Obviously we keep hearing figures of around 11, 12 T-flops being bandied about, which is certainly possible, but it's going to be very interesting to see exactly what those GPUs as well as CPUs end up being clocked at, and the number of compute units we have, particularly if there's going to be a discrepancy between the two, or if there's going to be any architectural differences. And yes, a number of you are asking my opinions of the Xbox E3 conference. I will be getting to that as well, but I did want to wait for the AMD conference because I figured that we'd get a lot more information regarding RDNA, and once you have that, of course, you can do a much better analysis of what Microsoft released. So now let's talk about ray tracing and NAVI. So this generation of cards does not feature ray tracing, so the RX 5700 does not have it. AMD believe that the ecosystem right now is just not ready for it. So you might recall that back in March of this year, I did release a video that the next generation NAVI cards would actually feature ray tracing. I was told that by an exclusive source, and guess what? It actually appears to be accurate, because AMD themselves have confirmed it in an official slide. They call this ray tracing vision. This was another thing that was not shown off during the live stream. So currently it's done on shaders, aka basically software. So you have ProRender for creators and basically RADEON rays for games developers. Hardware though is coming for the next generation cards. and this is going to allow selective light or for real-time real-time effects in gaming. And then after that, it's going to start to move to the cloud, apparently. We can also see a architecture roadmap. So previously, or currently I guess, technically because RDNA isn't out yet, we're on 14nm and 7nm GPUs, which is based on a GCN. So of course that would be Polaris and Vega. After that, we move to RDNA, which is on the 7nm process. And then 7nm Plus is going to be using RDNA 2. So that actually makes a lot of sense. And I was told that there were definitely architectural changes for the next generation of RADEON. And, well, it is basically panning out. So then, my thoughts on NAVI. Well, honestly, it's about what I expected. I think that I would have liked the cards to be slightly cheaper, particularly the 5700 non-XT, but I don't think the pricing is particularly bad. The only concern I've got for AMD is if Nvidia do decide to release the Turing refresh, which we could potentially see higher power limits, higher clock frequencies, maybe additional CUDA cores, and naturally there are a lot of rumours, and we will also see Nvidia launch the card with faster memory frequencies like 16 Gbps. If that happens, maybe they can hold on to the performance crown. Honestly though, a price drop is almost inevitable from Nvidia. I don't think they'll do it just yet. I think they're going to wait for the last possible moment, because why wouldn't they? These cards do launch on July the 7th, so it's the same date as all of the AMD Ryzen CPUs, well actually minus the 3950X, which actually launches in September. So it would appear that most of my leaks concerning NAVI/Ryzen have been pretty accurate, with the exception of the clock frequency thing. If you recall, back in the day I did say that one of the major changes with NAVI was that they were going to have the target of improving pixel pushing and geometry performance and just having a more efficient architecture. And honestly, looking over these slides, I think AMD have achieved this. The CPUs and the GPUs that AMD are going to be releasing is going to bring a lot of competition to the marketplace, and it's going to put Intel, for now, in an uncomfortable situation. I don't honestly know what Comet Lake is going to bring to the table. It's very possible that AMD may face stiff competition from Intel, because possibly Intel will be cranking up the clock frequencies even more for Comet Lake. No one really knows. What I do know though is that for the here and now, I suspect that a lot of budget builders are going to be choosing to go with the 3600. I'm going to be very curious to see whether the 3600 clocks to roughly the same frequencies as the 3600X, but you know, for $200-250, it's very hard to argue that that CPU, which, you know, the leaks are putting this at roughly the same performance level as 8700K, is going to be a really good deal. So I suspect that for the next several months, AMD are definitely going to be on the minds of many system builders who want to just build a decent value system. And yeah, the 3950X is just incredible. 16 cores, 32 threads, and it's just ripping through world records at the moment. There have been overclockers that have hit 5 GHz plus, and they are literally breaking 16 core world records, which is just amazing. It's really cool. And I think when new platforms and new architectures launch, it's always very interesting to see exactly what they're capable of. For owners who have a B450 or whatever motherboard, obviously you don't get PCIe, but if you're not doing hardcore video editing or content creation, you're probably not going to really notice at the moment, because you're not going to need the I/O from a PCIe SSD or for PCIe 4 SSD anyway. So I think that for a lot of people, just simply upgrading from like a 1600X and putting in like a 3600 or what have you is going to be a very much no-brainer decision. With all of that said though, I think that just about wraps up this video. There is still an awful lot left to cover, but honestly this video could end up being another several hours long. So I think that this serves as a great introduction and an examination of what AMD did announce, and also my thoughts of the overall conference. As I said, there will be much deeper dives on the architecture, as well as, of course, eventual reviews of the product when they go on store shelves. But for now, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'd also like to apologise for sounding a little croaky in this video. Unfortunately, allergies are just murdering me at the moment, so it's not the best of experiences, but hey, that's life. With that said though, hopefully you'll consider clicking the subscribe button as well as sharing the video. Definitely comment down below if you're picking up one of the AMD products, and are you gonna wait and buy the 3950X? If so, you've got quite the wait, and it can be a bit frustrating because you've got several months to just kind of watch everyone else enjoy their new systems. But then again, if you've got a pretty reasonable setup right now, it may not be that big of a deal. With all of that said, take care. Bye for now.